So we're going to take a look at ideas and projects today. We're going to make sure our goal for today, for today's class, is going to be to just sort of talk about general planning for like how you may want to go about generating ideas, how you may want to start to think about your projects. And some of these things you've probably heard me say before, actually, but they're definitely good to have brought back together. And now that you've got a few projects under your belt, your perspective on these ideas might be different since you've tried things, you've probably run into a deadline here or there before. Even just with the class, like thinking about deadlines inside of MakeHaven are different than deadlines at work or at school. So you definitely, it may be useful just to reflect on these things that you've probably heard before. And some of them you probably know better than I do as like management techniques perhaps. And so if you've got something that you want to say, you want to chime in, go for it. I mean, that's a part of the group. I've really enjoyed watching how our group as a team has started to have a nice inter-supportive dynamic. And so it's neat to see how much each of us can contribute when we hit our own like area of expertise. So it's a cool way to be engaged, to take a look at all of the things. And it's definitely neat to see how this works. So I've got Slack pulled up and hopefully I'll be able to watch that at the same time. And then there's also all of this stuff, but my screen is overlapped with things that you won't be able to see. So in any case, we're just gonna click on through the slides over here and sort of wander our way through. So first off, ideas and projects. That is the name of the game. Let's do, I think I can do presentation F5 for this. Present, and we'll just do that one. And then I think F11, nope, no, I thought it would do. Yeah, we'll just go with this. So here's where we're at. Okay, so our goal is to talk about ideas and projects in general. And I love this quote from Linus Pauling that is, the best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of them. And that's definitely true in MakeHaven. The more different things you have to try in any makerspace, the odds are definitely better that you're going to have a good idea. And it's just something where if you keep generating ideas, eventually one of them is going to stick, right? Like the old adage, maybe it's Midwestern, and it's kind of a weird saying, but the adage is even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while, right? That eventually you'll run across something that's good, even if you were just sort of aimlessly wandering. That's the idea. And so having lots of ideas is definitely a good way to run into a good one. And so you spend enough time doing different things, playing around, eventually you have something that's really worth the extra time to put into it. And so today we're going to go over these topics. We're going to think about how we can manage our ideas. And how we can sort of bring them into being, and how do we manage projects. And then eventually we're going to get to how do we make a lamp, which is sort of like the archetypical, the light bulb went off, even though that's not really how the brain works. It's the right sort of shtick. And it's a good thing to build in a week that could otherwise maybe not have anything. So here's our game plan. And I also love this Buddha quote, that the mind is everything and what you think you become, which feels like it may be overblown, but brain science actually backs that up more than you'd expect. That like as you have a thought and as you process those thoughts again and again and again, the repeated thoughts get reinforced pathways in your brain. So you really alter what your brain's structure is by how often you have a thought, how regularly you process a skill. And so let's talk about processing an idea or a project. So I've got this little photo story that's kind of hectic, but that's definitely sort of how these projects go, right? Good projects go through many cycles of improvement. And so as you take an idea and you process it, you're going to go through lots of different iterations, lots of different ways, in lots of different things. These are two kids who I oversaw last year was their senior year of high school. And I asked them if I could use these pictures, and they're totally fine with it. But they wanted to build a instrument for Science Olympiad. There's an event where you have to build an instrument from scratch using no musical instrument parts. And so they started off with not being very good at building things at all. And so they built just like out of sheets of plywood and scraps of 2x4s, they built something that like vaguely resembled a guitar. And it didn't take us too long to realize that this made noises, but it wasn't good at doing any of that. That it definitely it made noises, but they were just noises in general. And so from there, they decided that they knew that we had a CNC in the high school shop, so they knew they wanted to learn that as a skill in general. And so they built the original one first to like see what was good or what was bad, just to like mock up in general, how do you build an instrument? And then the boy, Nick, really drove it through this first round. And so he designed these things. I helped him get it set up so that it could get cut out. We glued together layers of plywood, and he made this sort of like pear looking thing that was guitar-like. And as we were building it, we learned different things, like that the top really needed to be as airtight as possible. So we went through, and like once it had been, we were hesitant to glue it down. They had hot glued it on because they didn't know if they'd want to remove it. And then they went inside and they like heavy hot glued it so that it was just coated in hot glue on the inside, so no air would leak out. You put on strings, and that worked pretty well with these turnbuckles for tensioning. These are actual guitar strings. They're like the one thing that they could use. And with some brass, when they started to tune these, it worked well and it would make noise. These bridges really help transfer sound to the like thin bass veneer. But it didn't take long for them to realize that it would fall out of tune. So we added brass rods to keep the strings from digging into the wood. Instead, they would distribute their force against these brass rods that would really expand, it would spread out the force so that it wasn't tearing into the wood with those strings as you played it. But that was the end of the first year. It's a 2-year project. The second year, Olivia here is holding up an egg. They wanted to redo it. They had so many troubles with retuning those strings that they wanted to try and make a kalimba where these were just at a fixed length, and then that would let them get the perfect pitch. That didn't work. They tried it. It would make noise, but like it had interference problems. And you would never expect that. But there's not many like completely round instruments that are also multitonal. We eventually realized that like maybe the shape of a cello has something to do with how it works, which I guess maybe should have made sense from the beginning, but you learn things as you go. So then we were back to design, and after a whole year of learning some design skills, they were definitely improved. We had that model that is now in my Fusion 360, but we took the model to our ShopBot, cut some things out, glued it back together. And then after this round, we played around with the hardware quite a bit on the top. We ended up with eye hooks instead of turnbuckles. But then there's 2 happy kids down at the bottom doing their final presentation, tuning up the machine before they go in to compete. So the thing about this is that like we've got a story. There's this narrative that's really cool, but it's totally, it looks linear when you tell the story afterwards, but there is no part of this that made any sense. Like we fully intended for this egg thing to work and had no idea that it wasn't going to until it was completely built. We had put it together and like it was tuned, and then we realized like when you'd strum the one thing, like one of these keys on the right, one of them on the left would wiggle also. And so we were way invested into the egg before we realized that it wasn't going to happen. And so at that point, after, probably 40 hours of building this egg, they're like, okay, we got to bail. We got to do a whole new design. And that sort of a narrative for ideas and designs is just part of how this works. That if you want to build something that's really nice, and I would say this cello is probably the nicest thing the high school ever churned out. It totally takes building and rebuilding and then seeing what little pieces work and what don't work, and then sort of nitpicking the details until you finally get to somewhere where it actually works. This cello would hold its tune for, like, you could tune it and carry it around on a school bus and then in and out of cold weather, and it would still hold its tune as well as any musical instrument would, like to within a half of a, I don't know that much about music, like to half of a pitch, to within a half of a cent or whatever the denotation is. And it was also as louder than the like upper range limit of what they were trying to get. So they really knocked it out of the park with this project, but it took lots of non sequitur progress. And so that's really an important thing that I want you to think about as we're looking at projects in general. And this is a good high school level example. The things that we're building are going to be all sorts of different and weirder. You know, we have different roles in life. They're not as contrived as maybe this is. But it's good to have an example in the back of your head if you're lacking one in your own mind for what to look at. So just going through these cycles of improvement. Let's get some vocabulary down. So as we're doing this, there's some key words that I'm going to use a lot that I think are really important that you're welcome to use as well, certainly, and might be helpful just to like frame some of these ideas. So a big one, and actually it's a pair that I like to use, is goals and constraints. The goals are the things that you want to have solved, your drivers for the project. And the better you know the goals of your project, the better you can achieve those goals, which sounds silly, but it definitely helps. If you know what you're trying to do, you can decide what it is that you really want to do, what's at the core of that problem. The other side of that is, what are your constraints? Like, do you have a limit on how big it can be, how much money you can spend, or how much you want to spend? In the guitar project, they definitely had a size limit that was set up by the rules of the competition. Maybe if you're building chopsticks, you want them to be antimicrobial. Or perhaps if you're building a small computer or a personal heater, you need to think about how much power is it going to draw. Right? Those are all different constraints that you might put on yourself when you're working on a project, just to make sure that you meet the goals that you have. And then there's iterations or different prototypes. There's lots of different names for this next one, but I like to think about it as iterations, that each time you build a solution, you're building on your progress. And we're going to see that I like to imagine that my projects have many iterations. There's never like a final end result, which saves me a few pieces of heartache. One, that I don't ever think I'm pursuing a perfect finished product. But it also means that I'm always looking for something to improve, right? That it's just a prototype and I can make it better if I try it again. If you look over my shoulder, like right here, this is the Barbot that I'm building, that I've been building. And that thing is version number 3. And when I finally get some free time in the wood shop, I'm going to be working on version number 4. I'm going to rebuild the whole cart that it's on. And that's just how it goes, right? Each time you've got things that you can improve and that you can make better. So next up, brainstorming and design thinking. Oh yeah.
Can I just dive in real quick for iteration?
Yeah.
And this is just something I run into in my professional life. And that is that, like, as a consultant, I often really have no idea what someone wants. And they are also like, I don't really know what I want, but like, we need to like figure it out. So the first like version of what someone thinks that they want, like in a professional consulting capacity, is usually not what they want. And that's kind of the beauty of projects too, right? Is that like, we have an idea of what we want, but we don't know what the new piece of information that we need is until we run into it. And like taking an iterative approach, like, is actually in a way, I sell my customers specifically on that like there is value in the process just as that there's value in the product. And that like our ability to have that mindset actually makes it much more enjoyable. So I just wanted to emphasize that I feel super strongly about iteration. It makes it more fun and more accessible and less, it lowers the stakes. So
yeah, it totally does. And we're going to go over spiral design and a few other processes that really drive down the mechanisms of iterative design. Yeah, absolutely. So there's going to be more in iteration later for sure. But brainstorming and design thinking are also worth talking about. Those are fun buzzwords. Both of them, it turns out, are pretty heavily branded, even though they've turned into like what inline skates are, right? It's where you've hit a branded thing that its name gets used so much that you forget who branded it. But I did pull up those names. They're in these slides, so you'll see in a minute, although I honestly forget for brainstorming. It's one guy for brainstorming from the 60s, and it's IDEO really nailed it for design thinking as those two pieces. Another thing that I'll talk about a lot is a sketch and a model. And a sketch is, I love a sketch for an idea. I was playing with 3D modeling software before class started, and that's definitely a model, but a sketch is a good place to start with any sort of an idea. And a sketch is usually like drawn on paper, but Lior and I were talking about the dust shoe, and this is like my three-dimensional almost sketch. It's like a dumb little model that's got, this is just regular printer paper that is the cheesiest thing that you could think of, but it gives just enough of an impression to like have an idea. And this is just enough where you can be like, that is terrible, and this is how to make it better. That's what a sketch is really good for. And this is linked to an article that really talks about the value of sketching as just like a way to invite conversation about an idea before you've modeled something and you're like too far down the road for people to question the core assumptions of an idea. So sketching is great. You should always make a quick sketch. Even if your goal isn't to do art, it's just to have something to get yourself started. A model is also good. So you can do 3D models or other types of models. There's lots of those to consider. And then a proof of concept. This is something I'll say also, that sometimes, like if you want to have a system with a bunch of blinky LEDs, you should definitely make sure that you know how to blink one LED first, right? And so if you want to have 1,000 blinky LEDs, make sure that you really get it for how one of them works, and then how to control 5, right? And then you do some sanity checks to just sort of get yourself on the way from the little pieces all the way up to the big stuff. But before we get too far into that, let's talk about just in general, how do people generate ideas? Because it's interesting. The brain is a complicated muscle that we've all got. It's not really quite a muscle, but sort of. And so how do we get ideas to happen? Like what's going on inside the brain that makes all that occur? And the short answer is we're not really sure. Like there's not a complete understanding of the brain or its mechanisms or how it works. And there's definitely people who understand it far better than I do. But here's 2 links from Reddit and to a researcher. These are interesting things. And I love the researcher link here. These are actual like videos of neurons moving around and making connections. So like one of the interesting things about the brain and about how it works is that there's these neurons that are working. They're organic webs that make connections. And so like the way that you understand things, the thoughts that you're having right now, the pictures that are going through your mind, they're all being managed by these little squirmy tubes inside your head that are passing electrical currents back and forth, and that it's worth it every once in a while just to like freak out about how weird that is, that it's a completely organic process, that these things are growing and moving and doing all sorts of weird stuff, that it can be disrupted, it can be thrown off. There's all kinds of things that can happen that make it as strange as you might expect, but that all of that is just mesmerizing. And so I happened upon those videos, which are definitely research videos from a Reddit post. Like I was just searching for neurons moving, dendrites growing. And so that's where it ended. It's broadly mesmerizing. People love that sort of questioning. And it's definitely something that's interesting to consider. And one thing that we do know about the brain is that usually instead of like a eureka moment, people usually are making nearby idea connections. If you think about an idea connection, and it's an analogy more than any sort of like causal real relationship. If you think about ideas as those connecting neurons, right, they're going to reach out to the things that are nearby. Rather than making a giant leap across your brain space, they're going to connect nearby thoughts. So if you're really good at thinking about one type of thing, you're going to relate a lot of things back to it. So if you're super, super into football, you will relate a lot of things back to football. And we've probably all had a boss or a coworker who uses football or baseball analogies a lot. I will not use those because I don't think about baseball or football much at all. And so it's definitely something that has interesting implications, that those thoughts and skills you practice the most, they have the strongest links in the brain, and the less used ones, they literally get pruned away. And it's an important part of how the brain develops. Young kids are really good at building those connections and pruning way, way faster than adults are. It's called neuroplasticity. It's totally a thing that we have to learn as teachers, and like how that changes as you get older. And it turns out your brain starts to change the way that it makes those connections. It's like rapid fire up until about 26. And then beyond that, you're like stable and in a slow, all of the most genius things people have done, whether it was Einstein and his relativity, whether it was Newton and gravity, whether it was some of the major orchestral works, those were all done at around 26 years old. Not all of them. Some of the orchestra people were much younger, but by and large, it's in that mid-20s range when your brain is in that perfect balance of plasticity and pruning all in one shot. But a neat thing about brainstorming and design thinking is that we can leverage groups of people's neural connections. So it's not just one person when you have teams all working together. And so let's talk a little bit about ideas and thinking about them. So when you're making a sketch, or if you're making a model, which is something I'm going to encourage a lot while you're coming up with an idea, it's very helpful for being able to visualize. So the napkin sketch is like a classic example of just being able to take an idea and quickly hash it out. This is a beautiful napkin sketch. This is what you get when you Google like very nice napkin sketch. This is what should come up. That's definitely not how mine look, but it's a really good example. An architect might give you something like that. And then you can do models or CAD models, but those are all different like levels of understanding. And I think they're really important sort of like as we, yeah, nobody's, I don't know if I'm not 26. There might be somebody who's 26, but improved. So as we get better with each one of our versions, if we think about a model and the level of detail that's invested in a model, it's definitely different. So a quick model is a napkin sketch. If you're hand building one of these architectural pieces, that takes a lot more detail, a lot more work. And if someone was trying to build from what you modeled, they would have a hard time building this building from a napkin. But an architectural model has been a standard for a long time. And then CAD models are even better. But as we have more and more detailed models of things, as we have better and better sketches, we have more information and we can think about an idea better as we detail out the idea even more. Usually the more formalized your processing, it also sort of pushes people from questioning the core assumptions, which is important to keep in mind. But like as we got a better and more detailed view of Mario over the years, as the sketch of Mario has gotten better from 1980s to 2020, more and more detail has happened, right? And so at some point, and I don't know when, Mario showed up with gloves, right? But it's interesting to like consider our picture of Mario got better over time. And at some point it got good enough that someone just had to make a decision. Does Mario wear gloves or does he not? Like, do we want him to be wearing gloves? Or what's the purpose of a plumber wearing gloves? And should he be, why would they be white? Why wouldn't they be leather colored? Right? So there's interesting implications when you start to process an idea more granularly that really making a model or a sketch invites you to do. And so that's something that you can actively manage and think about, like while you're trying to imagine what a project is going to be, is how well do you have it in front of you to make better ideas about it, to get more detailed. And I really have come to believe over the last, like, I'm going to go with 5 years, that pretty much the more you can see something, the better you can understand it. And if you're just imagining it in your head, you really have a hard time understanding it at all. And some people can really see crisp, clean pictures in their head. Some people see none at all, and I fall into that camp. But just being able to see something at any level and having it be a concrete vision is really important for helping you understand what's going on. So sketching and modeling is going to be a central part of how we understand. We're going to get better at these. We're going to do 3D modeling in a little while. That's a couple courses down, but it's an interesting thing for us to look forward to. But that said, sharing ideas and human connections are really the most important part of all of this. This is an interesting example of just like how people connect ideas and how the organic nature of our understanding is interesting. This is, these are 2 screenshots from the game Fold It, which is where we crowdsourced ideas. There were researchers on a 2010 paper where they took people and let them sort of work through bending proteins so that they folded together into shapes, and they're able to do active, biochemical research just based on people playing around and using their intuition and making connections, even in this sort of like abstract world. It's kind of a fun game. I've had high schoolers play it before, but connecting ideas and like making patterns, recognizing patterns, looking for trends, and making unique connections are something that fundamentally is human. Right? You'd think that a computer could solve how to fold this protein, but it turns out they're not the best at it. It's people that are better at it. And in 2010, maybe machine learning is catching up with people. I'm not sure. But for a long time, it's been this way. And the most creative models and the most creative things come out of people. rather than a machine. So even though it may feel like this is all a computer generated game that this example is, the core thing I want to share is that you should remember that your superpower is that you can connect ideas better than anything else can, that you can bring those things together and you can link thoughts that you have. And the more linking you can do, the more integrated your thoughts will be and the better you can connect ideas together. Remembering that your thoughts at some level, and I don't know exactly where or how, but at some level they're from the neurons in your brain that are connecting things together. And don't underplay that. It's good to lean in and let that guide you a little bit. You have experiences that will help inform what it is you want to do and what you want to make. And so definitely leverage that as you're moving forward with projects. So how do you like formally innovate? Like what's the thing that Aaron does for work? And please correct me when I say this wrong. How do you get people to innovate in teams and how do you get them to iterate and move forward? Here's the two buzzwords that are the most common that I have run across is brainstorming and design thinking. So these are often a corporate thinking process for brainstorming and design thinking, where a business says we want to make an innovative product, or the school that I last taught at said we want to innovate in our teaching space so that we reach all of our learners. And so they say like, this is our goal. How do we put in a structure in place so that we can have teams of people, like 100 people or 50 people work together to try and innovate and push an idea forward. And so there are systems that work pretty well at doing that. And so we've got these things where we can really move an idea forward. So we can take and sort of systemize idea generation and selection. And even though we're not really working on teams too much on our projects, it's still useful to think about these phases so that as you're trying to generate ideas, you can give yourself the latitude and the freedom to work in these sorts of ways and remember the practices that are here. You might have also been put through these sort of experiences, and maybe it's just good to have some perspective thinking about how they might be useful in your makerspace world rather than sitting through the work meeting, which is definitely sometimes the way that I have sat through work meetings. But again, your connections in your brain are the most powerful part of how you think. So we got to keep that in mind. So just to formally describe brainstorming and design thinking, brainstorming was popularized by Alex Osborne in his 1967 book, Applied Imagination, which is fascinating. And design thinking, sort of in its most branded form, was popularized by IDEO out of California, maybe spun out of Stanford. They have a whole design thinking class that then turned into an institute. Brainstorming largely, and having not spent any time in the corporate world, I imagine that this is a way to spin up ideas and then a business team takes care of it. 1967 doesn't seem like a decade where they were good at coming up with large systemic trends. Is totally my bias towards what the 60s must have been like in the business world, mostly from watching Mad Men, really. But you know, you get the idea that there's definitely something there. The newer version is IDEO. And so we have the start of a broader design cycle is really what you're doing with this innovation process for generating ideas. That you're going to think about it iteratively is definitely what I would consider the difference between those two. And the thing that's common is that you have a judgment-free idea generation phase. You follow it up by an idea pruning phase where you say, these are the good ideas, these are the less good ideas, or maybe these are the ones we want to go after first. And then there's some implementation and reflection. That's definitely consistent about both of them, even if it looks different. And so anybody have some experience with these processes that'd be good to share? And if not, we can keep going.
I think just like put it plainly, like I think that people often want to dive for the right answer first, but don't want to. I don't know. Like, how do you balance like play and work, right? And more often than not, that's what I run into all the time. That people are trying to negotiate these like disparate principles. But if you can have that space to say like, here's what I know, and there's a bunch of stuff I don't know, but if I can just keep working through it, I will find something in the middle, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, that seems to ring true. If we scroll all the way back to these kids, right? They were totally confident that they were going to move forward this way. And so that was their first idea. They had said, well, why don't we just take what we had and make it nicer? And they said, no, we want to do this one thing. And they were so confident that they invested, 50 hours into building this egg thing. And they had really said, this is what the right plan is going to be. But it was being willing to say, like, I have this idea. It was on the table with other ideas. Both of these were, at some point, I thought that either one could have happened, right? And they just picked one to go after as their first thing. But then being willing to make it, like, recognizing that this is an investment to get to there, but also being willing to back out and say, like, I need to be willing to try another thing, right? So and this is where I think the design thinking really shines beyond brainstorming, is that being willing to say, like, we have these ideas, let's take a look at many of them and try not to judge any of our possible prospects until we have real information to guide us moving forward as to what's the better of these options, and don't rule one as the winner from the get-go. So yeah, I think that's really an interesting part of this. Aaron, it looks like you unmuted again. Do you have more?
Yeah, and I think, and this is, I appreciate that you've called on me, but this is, in a way, like, it's kind of nice just to sit back and
No, you're good.
not have as much to say, but basically, I think one of the funniest conversations I have with people regularly is, like, how do we define failure? And how do we, like, set up an experiment in a way that we can own? Obviously, we don't know everything we want to know right now, but, like, what would be the best way for me to go about making an instrument? And how will I know when it's working and when it's not, right? So,
yeah. And
yeah.
Okay. That's a really good point. And I'm spinning off in a way that I think is probably helpful.
Sure.
And let me say this as a high school teacher, right? We teach our kids that we teach kids failure in a few different ways, but I think the English language really, really does no service to helping us get better at moving ideas forward. We have one word for failure that's like, it is for permanent failure. Like, you are a failure is a statement that someone could make and no one should ever make, where it describes a personal permanent state. We have you failed the test, which is also permanent, but and is like a post-mortem sort of event where it happened and then we move forward. There's this test failed as just a data point, like it's transitory. There's failing forward, which is that book that maybe you've read, where you talk about the process of trying an idea and letting it fall apart, and then picking yourself up from that and understanding that gives you information. There's a really good, and I should link to a video. Let me actually, I'm just going to hop over and find it. Control T, and this is, let's see, where am I even? Veritasium 248. That's the one that I want, and I spelled it all wrong, but videos, this one. So this is a great video that we're not going to watch it now. I don't want to play this, but can you solve this from Veritasium? He makes the argument throughout this video that when you're trying to figure something out, when you're trying to take a look at an idea, when you're trying to process something, really ultimately people want to have the right answer. Like, it's a core part of what we want, is we want to be right, but you gain so much more information when you're wrong. So he goes through this like guessing game with some people, and I'll drop this link in the chat if it hasn't already made it into the Slack channel. But his point is that you learn far more when you get something wrong, when you make a mistake. And sometimes that's even what you're trying to do. Like, where does this break? Like, what's the limit of what I can do with this tool? Or how do I push this idea so that I can find its edges? And by learning those pieces, rather than just confirming that, yeah, we're the best all the time, you learn far more. And so really being willing to process failures as a negative test that isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? If you get a negative test for coronavirus, we're all happy for you. But in some ways you could say that that's a failed test, that you didn't test positive, right? It didn't come back with a result. So like, processing failure is something that is hard and it's counterintuitive. And I think as a teacher, so many people have learned that failure is a thing that should only be avoided, that you should never be willing to risk it, I think is the injustice that even I have done. And at some level, I'm sure I still continue to do for my students. I hope that they understand that failing in that way is definitely more beneficial. Like I would much rather that my high schoolers have a failure early in life than they learn what it means to fail by like cheating on a term paper in college, right? In high school, it's a recoverable error. In college, you might get kicked out of the school. And so thinking about when and how failures happen is an important part of managing like how we move forward. And it's interesting and complicated, and we don't do anything that really makes it as nice as it should be. We should be more supportive in general as we think about failures as we move through a design cycle. And that's something that we're going to understand as we move forward. So design cycles, there are many, many, many of them. This is like the Google image search of design cycle. This is what you get. And there's just a bajillion of them. They're all over the place. They're not always helpful. There's lots of different versions to this. And some, I only partially read a few of them. So they may not even all be quite design cycles, but there's so much more about them that's similar rather than different. But it turns out they're really easy to sell, right? Like if you have a motivational business book and you want to sell that book, you do one of these, you get yourself a slot at a conference, and someone was going to pay you $30 for the book. So this is something where there's a little bit of a trap to like pick one. And I've actually been a part of a teacher team in Northeast Ohio where we said like, whatever you choose for your school's innovation cycle and your design cycle, pick one, whatever it is, and just stick to it. Because it's helpful to have a rhythm when people are transitioning into this. And so in my mind, like after having taught this for years to people, I think that a scientific method and a design cycle are really, they're pretty much the same thing. They're analogous processes that you being adults might have really found your way into. The fact that you're in this class makes me think that you're already probably pretty good here. And I may be preaching to the choir in a lot of ways. So when I think about, so just so that you can hear my sort of thoughts on it, I think that both the scientific method and the design cycle are structures that we give to define something in a formal way that let us have a structure to use until we sort of grow beyond that. And so, because if you're doing scientific research, you formulate a question in your research, you have a hypothesis, a prediction, you test the prediction, and then you analyze it. Your tests, by the way, a failed test is probably a good thing. If you're doing science, you want that failed test. But the key there is that when you're actually like in the thick of it, you're not saying like, hold on, I need to stop and write a hypothesis. Instead, you're just like, I think this is going to happen. And it's a little bit more organic. And that is really, it's more of an attitude than a formal process that you're going to follow through. And so even though you may want to try and think about these cycles, at some point you're going to grow past them. And I'd rather that you think about them as attitudes to develop than like a series of steps to follow, which is really an important part. They do add structure. They are great for getting started with ideas, but as you get better and better with these cycles, and for us, it's going to be the design cycle where you define a problem, you come up with some ideas, you refine those ideas into what you want, you build it, you check and see if it worked or it didn't, and then you start again. Like that cycle just becomes more natural, where you own the fact that it's a cycle rather than a linear opportunity. Yeah, that's awesome. The next piece is really just to try and boil these down into like, what is a design cycle if we were to try and make sense of this all together? And so how does this work out in a way that's useful? And I would really boil down any of these design cycles, because I had 20 on screen a few minutes ago, into these 4 steps. That first off, you're defining a problem, then you generate a bunch of ideas about the problem. You build an iteration, and it's important to remember that that's not a final product, that it's a prototype, an iteration, some sort of step on the way to getting there. And then you evaluate it. And then when you're evaluating it, just like Mario, getting more and more resolution as you go, when you build your first iteration, now you have a better look at what a solution could be. So that gives you a better starting point to start to process, like, is it working? Is it not working? What do I need to change? How does this need to go? right? Ruby and Layla just went through the process of figuring out how the tufting gun works. And only by, firing up the tufting gun do you really learn, oh, this is what we need to do different, right? That cycle is something that's natural, and you need to embrace and like embolden, so that you get deeper and deeper into that. You're empowered by it rather than sort of shrugging when something doesn't go well. That you take the fact that it tears up the fabric as an opportunity to say, well, why does it tear up the fabric? So that you can move forward and make sure that it gets better the next time through. And so the 7 steps that I've got over here are a little bit more formal, a little bit less graphical, right? But defining the project goal, looking at the constraints, coming up with as many ideas as you can. And it's important when you're coming up with ideas to not judge them, whether you're thinking of a little egg as an instrument or recreating a cello, or whether you're trying to test out different ways to make a shelf or to make a lamp. Those sorts of things, just to have a bunch of ideas that you can start to pick from and organize in your head, is going to be really helpful. And then building something is just one part of this cycle. So when you make something, which MakeHaven has make in the name, right? Making feels like maybe that's the core part of it. But I think the real important piece, as you're building more and more complicated things, is that building is a part of the process. That as you build, sure, there's some things that like we build and we don't really need to question. Like you build a quick desk for, I need a desk right now today because my kid is stuck at home and they have to do some work for school, right? Those desks are awesome. Kate's husband, I think, cranked one out. And that's a great thing. The goal was never to make high-end furniture, but if you were trying to build like high-end desks to make things like they do on 4 Eyes on YouTube or other woodworkers around the world do, that then you're going to build one and see like, what do I like and what don't I like about this model? What do I like about this version, and how do I build it again so that I get more of the look that I want, maybe a more consistent theme throughout the piece. And so you'll evaluate your iteration and then go for it again. That sort of cycle is really an important part to get to the nicest kind of products that you can. And so then how do you manage it? If you've got this cycle that could then spin on for a long, long time, like what's the next step? How does this go? And so project management, just like in general, if we're trying to imagine how do you manage something, and this is, again, we're going to talk a little bit about teams just for the fact of it's helpful to think about. There's sort of the grassroots version of managing a project where it's open source and everybody's sort of working together and the community organizes it. That's really great when that happens. It's also really a lot like herding cats, when everybody wants to help and they all have their ideas and everybody wants to be heard. It generally ends up being chaotic, but there's lots of people who are really excited. And so that's a really cool way for things to happen, but they're often a little bit less productive, but they're totally bottom-up ideas, right? So you've got that structure where the people at the bottom are making it happen and bringing together ideas, and they might get popularity that way. And that works. There's some open source software that totally is functional, that's brought together by teams of people that are sort of naturally organizing, and it can work really well. It can also really not work well, and the stories that you hear about are pretty much going to be the successes. So you got to be careful in biasing how these things go. Then over on the far right is monarchy management, is how I'm going to title this. But that's where there's a boss, and the boss tells the workers what to do. I spent 7 years of my youth working at a McDonald's, and there's a manager at McDonald's, and they tell you what to do. I really loved my managers. They were great people. They were nice to work with, but it's a one-way relationship in some instances. A good manager, it's not like top down and that's it. But you can imagine that there are worlds where that is sort of the way it goes, that the person at the top says, this is the plan, and that's it. And then there's interesting, like in between lands, these agile development. So if you're a developer, you might have heard of agile development cycles or human-centered development, where you're constantly revisiting and questioning what you're doing. You're always thinking about like, what is the goal? How have I made progress on the goal? And is this working or not working? Ready to abandon what you've been up to so that you can realign to where you're headed. That's totally sort of an in-between of the two. Right? You've got teams of people, and there is management to help make sure that they stay on track, but people are allowed to sort of have some exploration into how to solve those problems. And then also you stay really laser focused on what is the goal. The biggest thing that I think the leader does in that role is manage, these are the goals, these are the things that we want to make happen. And so even though this may, if you're just working on your own, it may feel like it's weird to go into these three things. But the lesson that I take from this is that always keeping your eye on the target and then having regular moments where you're like, wait a minute, I've been doing this for hours. What am I trying to get done? Like that moment of reflection is super important, just so that you can have your eye on the ball, that you're looking at where you want to go. That's really helpful. And so spiral project development. This is the piece that I really enjoy. That spiral development, I like this. This is questioning your thing, setting up your goals and constraints, generating ideas, building solutions, and evaluating. And I would talk about spiraling here. Each time you cross this barrier, the evaluate and question barrier, you should have a product that exists. And so I'll often try and do something. So I have a minimum viable product where, like, if I could only make it through this design cycle one time, do I have something that would work at all? Or do I have to make it through the cycle many, many times until it works? And so usually what I'll say is that when you're doing a project, you'll want to think about what's the core functionality and how do you get at that, right? How do you do the one thing that if you have one thing you want it to do, how do you make that happen? Like if you're going to build a lamp, make sure that it turns on, right? That's an important part of building a lamp. Or if you want a lamp that looks good in the light and you don't really care what it looks like when it's on, make sure that it looks good. But decide and then make sure that the first time you build the lamp, it does the minimum thing that you want it to do. And so then from there, you can improve and make it nicer and nicer and nicer. That each cycle you go through where you're questioning, generating new ideas, and building the new solutions, you've still got a deliverable. So that it's not like you can imagine a giant project is designing a fighter jet, right? Like, and I have never built a fighter jet, don't get me wrong. But building a fighter jet is a long process to get to an endpoint, right? And what happens if funding gets cut halfway through? You don't have a fighter jet if you're only halfway through building a fighter jet. But if you're focusing on, let's make the first round just like a small nudge from where we are, like how do we improve the motors on a jet body that we already have? Then you're able to make incremental improvements where if funding got cut off in a 10-year project 2 years down the line, and your first year goal was let's just make ourselves more efficient, then you still have something that at the end of the day could be useful, right? You've set your goals in such a way that it can be helpful to have some piece, even if you don't get to finish all the way to the end, right? And so those sorts of pieces are really important. This also works really well if you're willing, and in terms of a maker land, instead of building jet airplanes, it's really good for this if you're willing to source parts again, right? So like if you want to build your instrument and you want to build it the first time as just like a piece of wood and some boards and like nail them together terribly and hope that it makes a sound when you pluck a string, like it's good to see like what works and what doesn't. It gives you then something to question and like say what worked well and what didn't work well. Like, do you need to change everything? How well does the front and back need to be attached to the sides? Like you can ask more detailed questions once you have your minimum viable product that can make it better and better. And so if you're doing this with maker projects, right, you build your first wearable circuit. And now you're asking questions like, okay, what worked well from that? How would I make the next one better and more stable, right? You're saying, oh, well, I want to put it on a backing so that it can be removed or attached. Or if I want to switch, I want to do it with a snap because I saw that Kate did that and that worked well, right? You have different ideas on how this can all go and how you can improve your thought process so that you can improve each time that you cycle through a project. And this works, I think, within a project if you've got a big one going, and sometimes you've got a small project where you just want to hammer through. But even if you just keep this mindset, you can use it to help inform future things based on past experiences. It's like all of our parents who know far more than we want to admit, right? That they've got that wealth of information that's built up in their brain, that it's all there because they've had these experiences, they've questioned the things that they've done, and then they've got information to give back to us. That's all a part of having this attitude. And the more you lean into it, the better off it can be. But also, like if in general, we're talking about projects in addition to spiral design, there's also some other clever tricks that you can pull with your projects, like bottom down or top down or bottom up debugging and designs. So for projects that we're going to do, especially when we get into electronics, it's always going to be good for us to have projects that have a certain format. So if you can design your project in such a way that it is bottom up, you're going to be better off. And by that, I mean, you think about all the little detailed pieces first. So you think about the small aspects and you make sure that they get tested. If you'd like to have something where you press a button and a light turns on, first thing you do is you check and see, can I get the button to work? And then you check, can I get a light to work? And then afterwards, you put the two together. If you want to make a nice lamp and you want to get the circuit to work and you want to make sure that your structure of your lamp is fine and that it will hold the wire through some tubing, you're going to test each one of those things separately if you can, and then try and put them together. So going bottom up, thinking about the little granular pieces and then bringing it together to a big idea is really helpful. If you ever build something, and I've definitely done this, where it's sort of a house of cards, and you know at the start that all of these chips have to fall the right way, that all of the pieces have to align just right in order for this to work, the stakes are a little bit too high. Then when you've got something like that that breaks, it can be really troubling to say, like, why isn't this working? And so like a great example is if you've got your Wi-Fi at home, right? A lot of people in the world don't know how their Wi-Fi works at all, right? It goes down and they call Xfinity and they're like, my internet is down. I can't send you an email about it. So I'm calling, and they need it solved that way. I can't imagine that's any of you, but it's definitely something that happens because for many people, like that's too big of a system. Like they understand that their Wi-Fi is working or not working, but it's really hard for them to drill down on the granular parts. Like, is it the cable modem or is it the Wi-Fi thing? Is it connected? Do I still have cable TV or is that turned off? Like, is it what pieces and parts are coming together? So the more you can break up a project into small parts, the better off you are at being able to figure those things out. Yeah, that is definitely asking the next good question is definitely helpful. And so thinking about this is a good way to also integrate into this is to think about, like, just find the vocabulary that you want as another good piece. Like, what's the word and turn it off and turn it back on is totally right. And so coming up with the vocabulary, turning it off, turning it back on, those are all the right strategies, right? There's definitely things like that we need to learn and we need to do. The goal for all of these is to try and figure out how do you make those improvements? How do you get the little pieces to work? What are the, and I think that those are great suggestions because you're pointing in sort of known recovery troubleshooting paths that you turn it off, turn it back on, and you're hoping that it all works the way that you want it to work, that it should do some magical recovery process that's in there. And those pieces are all important for understanding like what is going on and how does this come back together. But when you're building something, those little pieces may be up to you. And so then start at the smallest you can, makes your life better. Another piece of starting small and keeping your attention there is just thinking about a modular project as much as you possibly can. And so if you've got a project, like a big project that's all or nothing, this can be, yeah, the Nintendo cartridges. A modular project can be really helpful. And so there's definitely modular things that you can put together where you build pieces and parts. And then if you can build those pieces and parts separately and bring them together, it'll often make your life better. Just because you can focus on one part or another part. And then if that piece that you're working on goes south, you can remove the one part and then fix it and put it back in, right? And definitely the world is built this way. This sort of logic has made it into cars long, long ago, right? They didn't want to put the braking system all together in one shot. They wanted to make replaceable, removable parts. The brakes and rotors, the pads and rotors, those are totally replaceable pieces. Software developers have just started to learn this for backend developers with Docker and Kubernetes, where they're starting to imagine microservices. And if our web server goes down, like what little piece of it has broken so that we can fix that little piece of it. Whereas older projects were definitely built in a giant way with huge files that had interconnected custom pieces that if one part broke, the whole thing broke. And it was sometimes hard to tell where and why. So modular projects, as much as you can make them modular, it will make your life better when you're trying to troubleshoot. Those are totally things that you want to make happen as you're trying to make them go together. And so just taking a look at that is going to be really helpful for when you're thinking about the next projects that you're going after. Another strategy that's really good, another strategy that's really good is serial versus parallel development. And so while you're working on a project in this entire course, like when you're thinking about it broadly, you want to work on the projects so you don't have to wait for one thing to finish before you can start the next thing. This is a Gantt chart up on top, right? And maybe you've seen a Gantt chart like that, where hopefully you're able to do a few things in parallel. So like maybe while you're 3D printing something, you're doing your documentation. Or if you're waiting for something to finish, you've got something else that you can do. You can write up your documentation for the portfolio. Those pieces are good to make happen. Or maybe you've ordered something and it's coming in, and then you look at the example use cases. So you have like an idea of what to do, how to hit the ground running when it actually gets dropped off by Amazon. Those pieces of thinking about how to work in parallel as a project develops is definitely an important part to making sure that you hit any sort of a timeline. It's also like the counter example of this is definitely why construction can get delayed, right? If your plumber has said, I can't do anything, the drywall people aren't going to come in because they're not going to put drywall over a wall that still needs plumbing put into it, right? So there's certainly a series of things that needs to happen in projects, and it may be unavoidable that at some level you have a serial progression of work that needs to go on. But the more that you can make it parallel, the better off your life is going to be, just because you can focus on one thing if you have to be stuck waiting for another. And so that's a helpful strategy. Another piece is time, and time is definitely hard. If we're thinking about all the stuff that our connected neurons can process and the things that they can't, time is definitely one I put in the my brain can't understand this category. There's lots of interesting things going on about time, and the more you want to nerd out about it, I'm in, because I'm a physics teacher. So we can definitely go deeper with that. But if you're just trying to think about time for your project, time in this sense, we're going to look at two ways. There's either supply side time, where you think about the time that you have, and then you sort of manage how you work on the project from there. And there's demand side time, where time gets allocated sort of as the project demands you, rather than you in charge of the project. And I know I've mentioned that before, but it can be a big difference maker as you start to better understand, this is how long I expect this to take. This is where the focus is going to be headed next. As all of those things start to come together, you're really going to get a better sense for how this all, how you can forecast like what's going to happen next. And a good example is, I know if you're trying to impress someone who's about to be your father-in-law, it was really helpful for me to know that it took about 60 minutes for me to put in a toilet, right? And so I was at my future in-laws house, and they needed some plumbing fixed. And just because I knew like how long it was going to take, it became something that could happen, and we could think about the timelines of what was going on. So if you know what sort of time frame a project is going to work with, it can be really helpful. And that's something that when you're thinking about 3D printing, or you're thinking about running a CNC, you'll often get time estimates, and those are really helpful to value and to like look at how's this going to work, like where do you get to balance together all of your time pieces so that you can use the time that you have instead of being stuck always waiting and wishing that you had more, which is definitely something we all want. But you know, we got to manage what we've got. Next up is triage. Sometimes in a project you need to triage, and it's just exactly what it means for a hospital, but a little bit less intense, that you're trying to assign priority to projects just based on how the funds work, how the resources are used, like where you can make the most improvement with what you've got. And so sometimes if you've got a competition that's coming up for those kids building their guitar, or if you've got a deadline, like you need to make this project before the holidays because you want to give it to mom, those sorts of deadlines can really mean that you're triaging like what needs to happen in order for these projects to make it to their endpoint. Or if you want to make a sale, right? What do you need to have to get it ready before you sell it? Those are all important pieces. I heard somebody unmute. No? Okay. And then the last piece of advice that I have for projects as you're working on them is document as you go. I've said this before, I will say it again. Documenting as you work on a thing is really helpful. Documenting afterwards is the worst. It's like you've got extra work after the work is done. And so we've all been there. I have definitely done it many, many times. And I'm doing it right now with my school, like with the things for the high school where I'm at. But documenting as you go is definitely nicer. So if you can find the discipline to make this happen for yourself, you're going to be happier. I guarantee it. So there's documenting as you go. Now, the fun part, right? How do you make a table lamp? This is the next piece. So we're going to talk about how to make a table lamp. It's worth it to say that we're at 8 p.m. I want to go through at some point and talk about what happened this past week with all of our metalworking stuff and sort of where we're headed and like how has all of this shifted around with COVID. But let's quickly talk about the table lamp first, I think, just so that it's there, and then we can do all of the sharing and talking later after we get through this. Because there's a few concepts with this that are a good fit. I do like that it's sort of the shtick of your lights, like the light bulb going off in your head, even though that's not necessarily how the brain works. It's still a fun, like romanticized idea. And it makes sense for me that then lamps are what we're doing. However, I do want to say that there's no, like, this wasn't in our curriculum for foundations. It's just something that everybody seemed to be interested in. So we've included it. But if you realize like, oh, I need to get things done from the last week, feel more than welcome to skip this one. It's sort of a free pass on the portfolio. If you realize after project management, oh, I need to manage projects better, and you want to get some things done and you're less interested in making the table lamp right now, then please go ahead and focus on getting those things caught back up. This is sort of a, if you choose your own adventure week. If you want to go back and take care of things that have sort of passed, but you still have hanging out there, this is a great week to make that happen. But if you want to make a lamp, here's how. So you're going to need a lamp making kit, maybe some extra 1/8 inch or 1/8 IPS tube, and we'll get into what that is in a second. And then something for a base to make your lamp. And then perhaps you'd like a cloth cord. These have become super popular where people get those nice, supple cloth covered cords to plug in their lamps. They just look nicer than the plastic ones. People really do enjoy having those things around and available. And they can look really nice. I've got one on my, well, I have a headphone jack cord that I looked at it and realized it's pretty buried. But it's like white and black fabric on top of the cord, and it just looks so much nicer than the standard black line. So if you're trying to build a nice looking lamp, it can be a good thing. So let's talk about well, actually, let's go back here. I want to quickly Google this lamp making kit because I think that that's something that's worth taking a look at. Lamp making kit. So if we just do this, we search them, and then let's pull them up on Amazon. There's tons of these, and they're all over the road. There's lots of different ways to make these happen. And so you can see that I'm just sharing these lamp making kits in general. There's some of these that are really formalized. This is the 1/8 inch or 1/8 IPS tube. These are called nipples by someone set that terrible standard name. But those are the lamp making kits. Here's one that just you stick it on top of a wine bottle. I totally have one of those over in the corner. There's other ones with longer tubing. There's these with the hoop to make them go over the top. There's some that have these lampshade bottoms that don't have the hoop thing. There's tons of options. You can buy them in doubles. They're somewhere in the ballpark of like $15. Here's one that's literally just to put on top of a mason jar. If that's your jam, I feel like that's exactly what my mother would want. She loves mason jars to an unreasonable extent. There's all sorts of these things that can really, you can get a lot of variety in how these work and how these look. But a lot of them you'll see like it's essentially a wire that's unconnected and then a base where you just wire the things in. The circuit for these is pretty easy. And most of the kits have a switch that's either in the lamp base or it's in the wire itself. So like here, those are connected. Here, the switch is in the lamp base or it's in this is an inline switch and this is in the lamp base itself. So you'll get a lot that are like that. And we're going to look at some of the details of how these things all work. But there's tons of options. Like if you find If you really want to make yourself a mason jar lamp, go for it. They're probably the cheapest. But these kits you could walk in and buy one at a Home Depot or Lowe's for sure. Amazon also has them for sale that would come in pretty quickly. You can even get these ones that are like exactly what you find in a hotel with a plug and a USB port, which honestly, that's useful. I wouldn't be upset if I had one of those. But coming back to here. So the lamp making kit is building, in any case, no matter which one you get, you're going to be building this circuit. So the circuit doesn't get a whole lot easier than this. It is an alternating current circuit, which is different from what most of our circuits are going to be. You're going to have AC power running into this plug. And so the plug that you get out of the wall is alternating current, which is different from any electronics that you're working with, because current flows in both directions. But essentially it works the same way, that you've got your power, and there's a switch up here. And if the switch is closed, the lamp is on. If the switch is open, the lamp is off. That's it. And so the mechanism of the switch can be a little bit different, but this is essentially all that you're doing. And you want to just imagine, even though it's wiggling back and forth instead of moving linearly, you can imagine power coming from the hot, through the switch, through the lamp, and back to neutral is the terminology that we use for AC power. There's ground. I'm sure you've heard grounded things for AC power. A grounded plug has got the third prong in the bottom, the one that's round in America. And that plug is not ground in the same way that it is in a DC circuit. The ground in an AC circuit in your house is literally tied into the ground somewhere, or it's plugged into or it's attached to a copper pipe for your cold water. It's literally attached to the ground, because in your grounding circuit in your house, you want those to have, the ground is just an exit in case something goes wrong in a circuit. So if, let's say you want to build a fancier lamp than just the basic one, and that might be true if you want to have multiple light bulbs or whatever, you may want to put your light bulbs in, but you'll probably want to put them in parallel. That way they each get the full power from the plug, and you'll still want to have them in series with the switch. So power comes out through the hot, goes through the switch, and then it can go through either of the lamps, so that if you don't have one of your bulbs plugged in, the other one would still stay on. If these were in series and you unscrewed a light bulb, it would act like an open switch, which is probably not what you want. It's definitely good to use wire nuts if you're just getting used to, and I should pull that up also. Wire nuts are really helpful if you're just trying to figure out how to test all this and you're working at mains voltage, which I definitely want to say, if you're doing this, you need to be careful, because mains voltage can and will bite. DC voltage is going to be safe and fine for our low voltage DC stuff, but wire nut, or this sort of current, if you get it wrong, it can melt. This is not going to be common. I've worked with lots and lots of wire nuts. This is if something's going terribly wrong. But this is how most wire nuts are going to work. They're just going to bring together the ends. Instead of having to solder, you just sort of put it on and then twist it. So you might have worked with some of these before. And definitely make sure that when you're playing with these, your entire circuit is unplugged. You don't want to have, this is bad practice, if you don't want to be working on it while it's plugged in, because again, yeah, it's going to be able to, it's going to hurt if you get electrocuted with 120. I've done it many times and it's not great. I'm on my like third wristwatch because I've just gotten electrocuted too many times with them on. But let's head back to here. Then let's see in the chat. So if you're doing this, you want to make sure that your circuit is good. This would be for if you're building a more complicated lamp. And so we can talk about that. Another thing, that if you're building a more complicated lamp with multiple lights in it, you're going to want to make sure that your switch is rated for what you've got. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about, is it able to supply enough current safely through the switch? Look at the watts of your bulbs and don't let the current draw here exceed what the switch can carry. And so there is a little bit of math. The good news is it'll all be, you know, relatively simple numbers, and it's generally helpful. But oh yeah, those are all important things for you to see, Kate. The chandelier project that you did, I'm sure, is just fine. This is actually, so even though it sounds like it's risky, you should be totally fine with lots of these things. You follow instructions, and there's many instructions on the web. It'll get you through just fine. You can also call me up, show me a picture, and I can help you figure it out. my old department head in the science department at the last school literally called me yesterday and said, "Hey, let's talk about this circuit in his house." So I'm game for that at any point. Shoot me an image, call me up. We can talk about things. If you want to just get validation before you plug it in, I'm happy to do that. So let's talk about switches. One of the things, if we're going to say that you need to be careful about switches, I want to identify and classify switches. And this is something that's going to be really helpful as we move into electronics eventually. It's just really helpful to have thought about switches in all of their different ways. So we specifically did wearables so that we were ready for this conversation, right? A switch is just ultimately a way to make or break contact in a controlled, planned way. And so there's lots of different categories. This SPST switch over here on the right, this is the quintessentially easiest switch to wrap your head around. You have a wire that comes in, you have a wire that comes out. If this gate is open, there's no current flowing. If this has got contact from copper to copper, then it's closed and current will flow. That's the simplest switch that you can have. And this is a single pull, a single throw. This is the pull, the part that moves, and the throw is the thing that it can attach to. This doesn't count because it's constantly attached to that one. This is a throw that it could land on. And so single or double pull and single or double throw are categories of switches. This one over here on the left, this is a single pull double throw switch. So it's really similar to that one, but it's different in one key way. There's this interesting mechanism at the top. That's not anything. Then there's this black plastic button. Yeah, switches are really, you can absolutely make your own switch. I've definitely done it. You want to be careful about how you do it. You can see that there's some isolation here to keep them electrically disconnected from other stuff. But building your own switch can be a really helpful way to make things work. And switches like these kinds of switches, I'm all about that they're ugly. There's lots of good options. Vintage switches are definitely making it on the hipster rounds as hipsters get houses, which is going to take a while, I guess. But the key here is that you've got lots of options for how switches can look. And so there's tons of good options if you're really willing to go down that like Etsy rabbit hole. But we can also talk about how to make them, because essentially all you're doing is trying to make or break contact. And in this case, you've got your button that comes down, it pushes on this little copper leaf, and the copper leaf is always in contact with this common lead, and it's either going to be in contact with this one or this one. And so these two leads, this is a single pull double throw. This is the pull that moves up and down. It's the moving part is the pull, and then the throws are the places where it makes contact. So there's this throw and there's this throw. This spring system in here does a good job of keeping it so that it's attached to either one of them. So it's definitely attached to one or the other thing. That's the point of this spring deal. And so this is the one that if the button isn't pressed is normally in contact. So this is the normally closed side. And this is the one that if the button isn't pressed is open. And so when you press this button down, the normally open one will become closed and the normally closed will become open. Just maybe that's self-explanatory, but it's definitely good to hear and have that validated. You'll see this exact kind of switch really commonly on 3D printers as limit switches. That, especially with this roller here, that's an example of what you want to have. So this is where you'd see something like this. But they also, this exact kind of switch where you've got a common and then two contacts, that's also how three-way switches work. And I've got a diagram coming up that shows how those play. So those are all important things to take into account. There's also these other categories. So here's another SPST.
Corey, I'm sorry.
Yeah. What's up?
Can you give another example of how the SPDT, like where that would work? Like, is this a button that needs to be pressed in order to get something to move or work?
So this is a button that when you press it, the contacts change. And so you can actually wire this lots of different ways. Like I have done it so that when you wire it up so that this normally closed isn't attached to anything, but the normally open is, so that when the button's pressed, a light would turn on, let's say, and if the button isn't pressed, it turns off.
Right, right.
When you have an SPDT, just because they're all available doesn't mean you have to use them all. And if you just use normally open, it works like a momentary single pull, single throw. This is helpful for if you want to definitively know both states, but it's also sort of a weird case. A lot of the times they put both of these in these buttons just in case you're engineering it and you would like one option or the other. What I
Okay.
found that's really helpful is like a DPDT, a double pull, double throw, which is this little guy way down here. If you put positive on C1 and negative on C2, and then you're really tricky with your wiring of A1, B1, and A2 and B2, you can actually use a switch to flip polarity on a motor. And the best example I've got for that is for this DPDT is, let me get out of here, hit escape, is a useless box. Have you ever seen a useless box? That's not, okay, I'm in my way. Not wire, not useless box. A useless box like this. Let's do videos. Useless box, I want a really short one, 55 seconds. So a useless box does this. It just comes out and a finger, this is a weird one, but a finger just presses the, isn't that fun? You get this and it doesn't, it's not doing anything really useful or exciting. Oh, this one makes noise at you. People like to get real cute with them. But useless boxes like this, there's a switch and the switch spins the polarity on the motor. So like when you do this, the motor comes up and then, but this is a really fancy one. People love on the internet to make these things and then make them overly fancy. So let's do useless box wiring diagram. And so inside of a useless box, you're going to have a circuit that looks like this. And so here's a double pull, double throw, where your battery, the toggle switch on top changes the polarity to the motor so that when you flick it, the motor's headed up out of the box. And then when the arm presses the switch, it changes polarity to the motor so that the motor is then headed back down into the box. And then when it hits the bottom of the box, there's a shutoff so that it doesn't keep spinning through its own base. This is the essence of a single pull, of a switch like that, where you can totally use all of these cases. And it's just thinking about how do you want your connections to be made and broken. It's not necessarily, and they can get really ornate, like these are people drawing all sorts of examples. And the more complicated you get with your switches, the more interesting it can be. The good news is that we're not going to do a lot with this, with getting real ornate with switches for our projects. Most of ours are going to be digitally controlled, so you don't have to worry about figuring out all of these details of circuits. If you want to, we can absolutely go down that rabbit hole. But it's not necessarily something that you have to make sense of as we move forward with Arduino. This is like using the logic of the switch to make it happen. Whereas the fancy ones that I was talking about, those were all done with an Arduino or Raspberry Pi or something at the core of it, so that it's making decisions when you activate the switch based on programming as opposed to just being electrical connections. But this is totally something that could be a good project if you just want to explore the logic of switches and how they work. Yeah, I can absolutely send you down this rabbit hole. I will totally send a link, but just start searching useless box wiring diagrams and you can absolutely get some interesting things. So there's tons of cool stuff that goes on in there. And if we're taking a look at circuits in general, these are good things to have as your vocabulary. Just knowing, even if you need to look them up every time you get to a switch, this is a good thing to have. Most of your switches that you interact with on a daily basis are toggle switches, unless you count the keys on the keyboard that are sitting right in front of you right now. Every one of those is a momentary switch. So those are buttons that when you press them, there's electrical contact, and when you stop pressing them, there's no electrical contact. And in a lot of the case, these momentary buttons are really useful if you've got some sort of logic system on the other side that can read what it's saying. So like in the case of the keyboard, there's a keyboard chip that's reading all of those button presses and then telling your computer what to do. And in a toggle switch, when you flip the switch, it stays there. Relays are an interesting category because these are all switches that are controlled by this coil over here. So when you power up this coil, it'll flip the little spring that goes back and forth between these two contacts, or in this case, it's either connected or it's not. And so you can use a small current here and usually pass a lot of current on this side. So if you want to have something really tiny like an Arduino or Raspberry Pi that can control the lights in a house, at its core, you're going to use a relay. And so if you've got a smart switch around, you might hear it go click. And when it clicks, that's the relay firing. And so if you listen really closely, when you switch your smart switches on and off and you listen to them and you hear a click, that's most definitely a relay inside where there's a mechanism that's clicking the electromagnet on or off. Sometimes they're toggles where they stay in that state, and sometimes the coil is constantly on when it's on or constantly on when it's off. And that all gets down into the specifics of the wiring of that particular switch. But definitely learning more about how switches like this work can be really helpful if you want to go far down that rabbit hole for the mechanisms of how your switches work. Most of the time, I think you're going to be fine if you know how a button works, a momentary button works, and you know the single pull double throw, whether it's this kind that's momentary or whether it's a toggle where it stays for your regular old house switches. But if you think that switches are ugly, you may want to think about how and where to put them for your lamp. You can build a lamp without a switch at all, which then needs an outlet that's switched perhaps. Or you can panel mount your switches like this, where there's something that you'd mount onto a fixed surface. And so these are all different categories of panel mount switches. These are some toggles. Here are some other toggles. There's buttons or rockers. These are all things that can be mounted to a surface. I really like this picture here. This is a single pull, single throw. There's only 3 contacts across the bottom. So this is the common one. One of these is normally open. One of them is normally closed. And then it's got this little threaded segment and some nuts. Those are so that you could sandwich a sheet in there. You drill a hole that's just bigger than these threads. You push the thing through, and then this nut on the top will hold the whole thing in place. So you imagine a metal surface. This is pushed up through, and then you've got these big ominous switches that sit on top. Right, so there's the nut and then a little on-off plate for this guy so that you can see sort of what's going on. This looks like a big industrial thing that maybe is a little bit more complicated. You definitely want to read up on your switches details if you wanted to know more about how to use that one. But it's a lovely, like, scary looking thing. Let's see. Oh yeah, there's tons of good options. So then inline switches, these are, inline switches are switches that you just put right on the wire or maybe in the base of the lamp right here, this little tug line. Inline switches can be really nice. Sometimes you can put those right where you want. And if you've got a swag lamp that you're trying to use, an inline switch can be good to put in line exactly where you want it. I was digging around, but I'm going to have to dig a little deeper. I made some swag lamps for the house back in Cleveland, and they're definitely neat things to have. And you can put the inline switch exactly at the right height for you to walk over and hit it easily. So there's definitely some usefulness to this. The one thing with inline switches is that you'll probably need to cut your wire as you're putting it in. So you'll open these up with some screws on the back. You'll take a look, and just like Kate found when she crushed it in the arbor press, there's some contacts that are made and broken inside there. So you'll want to look at the rating to make sure that it can handle the current that you want. But if you're building a simple lamp with just one bulb, whatever inline switch you buy is going to be fine. And then here's the 3-way switches. This is another good switch riddle if you're trying to go down this rabbit hole, where you're probably not going to do this, but if you're wondering how the lights work at the top and bottom of your stairs, this is how they're wired. You've got power that runs in from your circuit breaker at hot and neutral coming from your mains. And so the hot power comes into one of those 2 switches, and the other switch goes out to the light that's at the top of the stairs, right? And so the bottom stairs switch has 3 conductors going between it and the top conductors and the top switch. There's the A and B. This might be the white and the black line. And then for a 3-way switch, there's also a red line. It's usually red that goes between the two. And so in this case, if you think about what happens for these poles, these diagonal parts, they can be either connected here, or if I flip this switch, it would be connected there. And that will let me control on either side. Anytime I flip the switch, this light will turn on or off, regardless of the state of the other one, right? It's a little bit of a brain teaser, but if I take this switch and I flip it, then my hot is never connected to my neutral, and so power doesn't flow. So now I've got it up here and this one up here. If I were to flip this one, then this is connected and hot can go here, zigzag up through, and then back through there, and that would work. And so this has got power. Now, if I flip this off, then it would be back up here. You can sort of work your way through all the different combinatorics of that setup. And this system works perfectly well, so that you've always got contact or no contact as the next flip switch, so that it's always going to work the way that you expect it to. And then it's really helpful to like go stare at your stairwell and like flip the switch and stare at it for a little while and be like, okay, how's this going? It's definitely a good thing to ponder, just to think about. Switches and like learning how switches work can be a really interesting way to get better as a maker. If you just want to do that and never worry about, you know, writing code for an Arduino. It's a really good skill set to have if you can run through the logic of switches, which is all Boolean logic, which we'll get to. But let's just give you some AC power vocabulary. We've got hot, neutral, ground. And so the hot wire is the black wire or the brass screw. The neutral is the white wire in your wall. And if you've ever, you know, replaced an outlet, you've seen this. And the ground is the bare wire with a green screw. And so here's from the Family Handyman, which is a magazine I did used to get. Here's your line wires coming from your circuit breaker box. They might come into a GCFI. And so this guy right here has a little tiny circuit breaker inside. And so these things are definitely helpful if you want to predict what's going on down the line, although every circuit has a circuit breaker at its start, or it totally should, in order for you to manage the current running through your walls. So here you've got your electricity. It comes into here. This is by no means an attempt to make you an electrician, by the way. So don't like go rewire your house as a result of having this little conversation.
Is it real silver, or is it just color?
Silver colored. It's like it's silver colored. It's not silver for real. But it is a real brass screw. So that's really brass on that side. The silver colored one is probably plated with something, or it's like aluminum. I'm not sure what the material actually is, but it's silver colored for sure. And so with that wiring setup, you come through here, you've got these connections, there's some pigtails. An important thing is that all of your outlets are hooked up in parallel. And so that way you don't have to have each one is independent of the others, but they do need to be in series subsequent after a GCFI in order to be protected by the GCFI. So this is an interesting wiring diagram. Pigtails are really common. I encourage you to wonder about your circuits, but you know, you should get a real electrician if you're doing some rewiring. But I've definitely done a lot of this to a house that I've owned. So if you have a question, I can help you out.
I do. Can you explain series and parallel as it relates to this?
Yeah, absolutely. And so let me see, can I do, the pointer isn't that helpful. So for this, like so let's take a good look. Imagine just power comes in through here. And so if we're ignoring that this is a GCFI, right? If I have power that comes in, and let's say I have something plugged in right here, like a lamp that's turned on, this lamp would need to have power that comes from hot on this side to neutral over here. And so this being plugged in would be able to have a path to go from hot back to neutral and back out. And this is in parallel to this plug, where if this is plugged in and this isn't, it's not going to stop it. So coming back to here, if they're in parallel, then if this one's on, it doesn't impact whether that one needs to be on or not. But they're in series, these two lamps are in series with this switch, so that if this switch gets flipped off, all of the things down the line, right? If you're imagining current comes out of hot, goes on through here, and it can only pass through the switch if it's closed. If it's closed, it'll go through and it can go either way. Parallel means that it has multiple paths to progress. But if it's in series, it would be stopped if it gets stopped here. So the current comes out of the hot and then it can't go anywhere. It's just stuck. So because these are the switches in series with this parallel group, this is able to shut off both of these. And so this is essentially the same thing as the outlets that were in here, that this breaker is actually, so you can imagine power comes in, it goes through this breaker system before it even gets to the plugs, so that it's in series. These plugs come after this test reset deal, so that if this thing trips, it cuts power to these plugs and it cuts to these plugs. Any of these plugs are all in parallel, so you don't have to have something plugged in. If these plugs, and so that's a good point. If this plug and this plug were in serial with each other, then what would happen is I would have to have something plugged in and turned on in this plug in order for this plug to work. Because if current couldn't flow through here, it wouldn't be able to flow through there if these were in series. And so they're in parallel because power gets delivered to this nut, and then usually there's a little metal wing that connects over here, and actually the tamper resistant outlet. I want to look it up on Home Depot.
And
Yeah.
I'm used to DC.
Yeah.
So with AC, that common white wire, is that just to link the hot wire? Or
No,
like what does it do?
No, that's totally a good question. And so here's what I'm saying about parallel. You can see those brass nuts on that side. Let's see if I can get one of these turned around to show you the other side. They're not going to show the other side of the thing. Oh, but there's a good picture. So you can see the silver on the one side, the brass on the other, and then the green one down at the bottom.
Yeah.
Those are the colors that you'd probably see on a plug. And there's that little metal tab that's between the two screws, that if you're wiring these into your house, that wire tab connects the two screws in parallel so that the top and the bottom are both connected to each other. And then power can go from the right side of the switch to the left side if you're wiring that way. If you want these to be out or you want them to be disconnected, you can actually break that tab off and then go from there. If you wanted them to be not in parallel, if you'd like them to be in series or set up in some other configuration. So there's that. Yeah, if you have an old house, the colors are definitely more flexible. That's true. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. There's also really, really old where there's pull and knob. So they don't look at all like this. They're just single individual wires that are wrapped around glass knobs that are hidden throughout your house. Those are tenuous at best. I think that if I was in the Midwest, which is different than buying a house in New England, I would not buy a house with pull and knob wiring if I could avoid it, even if it was in the best neighborhood. This Romex wiring, where you've got all your wiring in a nice system that works like this, is much nicer.
So if parallel is them working independently, then why would that knob keep them in parallel, and breaking it, which would break the link between them, creating separateness, make it series? That seems counterintuitive for some reason.
It doesn't immediately make them in series. That little knob lets you put them in series if you want. It's typically you break off that knob if you want to do a switch, like 1/2 switched outlet. So you've probably been in an apartment or a house where you flip a switch and then a plug gets turned on. And so there's like a lamp plugged into that. And so that tab is usually broken off, and then you'll get power that runs out from the top outlet through a switch, and then from the switch back to the bottom outlet is typically how those get wired. So that's really helpful if you wanted to do that. So if you, and it's for that reason, so that you could put something in series with it if you wanted to, but by default, the two parts of an outlet are wired in parallel, and the tab lets you remove that to change that dynamic if you want.
Okay.
Yeah, but And I think it's a really important thing. Our names for current don't do us any favors when you're trying to jump between AC and DC, because the names here for hot and neutral in this, I would consider this like power and ground in your DC circuit, where this is from the top of the battery and this is from the bottom of the battery. And the ground in an AC circuit is a misnomer. You should never, ever really have current flowing through ground unless something's gone wrong. So the ground in an AC circuit is different from ground in a DC circuit. In a DC circuit, you just like set it as the bottom of the battery's voltage. But in an AC circuit, a ground is there so that it's literally attached to the ground. And this is what a GCFI is for. They constantly compare the current passing through the black line and the white line, the hot and the neutral. And if they're different, if the hot and neutral aren't the same current, if the hot is passing more current than the neutral is, then this test reset thing trips. And that happens because hopefully current is, instead of going back through neutral, it's going through the ground wire. And then if you're in a really bad spot, this trips because more current is coming in the black line and then it's going out through the sink or through a toaster or something where it really shouldn't be. And so the first line of defense is your grounding line. Well, I guess is the GCFI. And then if you don't have GCFIs in a kitchen, you hopefully have the kitchen grounded. So you have grounding plugs in your kitchen outlets. And if you don't have grounding plugs in your kitchen outlets, then it's time to start saying, maybe we should get the kitchen rewired. So if you just,
it's basically like taking the excess so that friction isn't created, which would cause a fire.
Yeah, because if your hot wire is, well, and if your hot wire is giving more current than is cycling back to the power, back through the neutral line, then that current hasn't like disappeared. It's gone somewhere. And the worry would be that it's going through a person, right? That it's going through that it's somehow you've spilled your toaster into the sink and now it's going through the water, or that a person's getting electrocuted, or that there's something bad going on. And so these GCFIs are there to stop that, so that if there's ever an imbalance, they know that something's happened. And it's pretty low stakes. Like, it's easy to go over and press the button again to get them started up again. But they do protect from current just going willy-nilly throughout the kitchen, which is definitely helpful. So they're required in all kitchens and bathrooms, which is definitely a good move.
But wait, is the pigtail part of that, or is that is that like a fuse, and then the pigtail just takes the excessive?
Oh, a pigtail, yeah. So
the ground in this scenario.
So the GCFI is like a fuse that will cut off power to all of these. And the pigtail is sort of a maneuver. You do a pigtail whenever you've got multiple things that you want to connect together. So I think of a pigtail as, I've got this ground line and I'd really like it to get to both of these. And so a pigtail will let you connect some wires together with a wire nut. And so that's what this is. The ground, so this is a fuse.
Not the pigtail, but the ground.
But the ground wire itself is just the secondary path. So like, if this breaker isn't working, having a ground wire there means that if the GCFI is broken, because these do get old and need replaced every so often, and if this isn't working, then at least you have a ground wire there, so that if there's spare current that's wandering off out of your circuit, hopefully it's got the ground wire to get back to somewhere that's safe instead of going through a person or somewhere where it shouldn't be.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is just like a return. Ground in AC is definitely different than ground in DC circuits. On your lamps, so if you're building lamps, and it's going to be tempting to build lamps that have metal chassis, because we just finished metalworking, even though metal would conduct current, do not run hot or neutral through the metal of your lamp. You don't want that to be able to wander off out of there. But it is definitely a good idea to take the body of the lamp and attach it to ground if you have a grounding line on your lamp. That way, if anything breaks inside the lamp and like you start to get electrical stuff going on, it would be able to quickly get to ground, which would be like the entire metal part of the body, right? So if you've ever installed a hanging lamp like this, like an installed lamp in a house, you might know that there's a little green nut somewhere inside there where you should take your ground and connect it to the metal chassis of the lamp itself. So that's really common. For desk lamps, there's usually just 2 plugs, which is totally fine. For most lamps, like if your lamp started to break down and have short circuits, you should just throw it away. But if you've got an installed piece, people may not be so anxious, so like ready to take it all apart and get it out, just because it would take more effort. You might need an electrician. And that's why they ground those, so that if something happens, they can be grounded, and you'd expect current to jump away through there. With the old house, there should be a ground wire. That's a good question. However, if your house was built before the code for a ground wire went into place, then you can be grandfathered in and someone doesn't need to do it. However, if in Ohio, if you had an inspection, they can flag that as a thing with the house. So if I went to sell a house in Ohio that didn't have grounding wires anywhere, it could get flagged on an inspection, and then they could make me put in grounding lines. So it's tricky. It's probably safe if it's been there for a long time. But if you're looking for ways to spend money, putting in grounding lines for all your plugs could be a good way to improve safety, or maybe doing it just for a kitchen or a bathroom. But for a long time, we didn't know. Yeah, it totally is interesting. If you've got something that you can open and like look at what's going on inside to see what's happening, it's good to question like what is going on here. And I would say, like, I had a basement in my last house that was very accessible. And so if you have an accessible basement underneath a kitchen, it could totally be worth it to spend a week or so putting in grounding lines just for the peace of mind that it gives you. And you can absolutely add those in on top of wiring that's already there. There's entire systems in place just for that. So if now you find yourself like nervously wondering, is my house safe? It's not it's the same that it was 10 minutes ago. So calm down. And 2, there are mechanisms that you can pursue to try and make it safer if you want. So those are the two pieces of advice I have, which is maybe still not that helpful, but yeah. So coming back to lamps and like thinking about how do you build a lamp, here's, yeah, if you pull down all the drywall in an older building, it's going to be nuts to see what's behind it. It's totally a good idea. I'm going to share some pictures after we're done, just to show you like all of the crazy stuff that I found in the last house when I pulled it all apart. But in here, these are some lamps of different categories that I think it's worth it for us to work through, just to like look at the details of these things. Here's a table lamp, and this is a nice one. It's got just a little wire running through. You can see that's one of the cloth covered wires on this one. This is a swag lamp. So this is one that I had put in before Anna asked, but it's definitely a good question. This kind of a lamp has just got a wire running through here, usually through a chain. The ones I did, I put it through a rope. But it's totally just using this as a way to structure the wire. So it's not just like a bare wire hanging there, because holding the thing up by a chain is much, much better than holding it up by the wire that carries the electricity. Then you've got these installed lights. These are pendant lights that hang down. And so you've got these pendant, or maybe like a candelabra or chandelier, depending on how fancy you want to describe them, where you've got a metal body, and that metal body, you can imagine there's tubing, and through these pieces of delicate looking tubing, there are 2 conductors running out to these light bulbs on the end. Each of these light bulbs are wired up in parallel, and I would imagine for this guy, they're wired up in the middle. And that seam right there is probably where some electrician wired them together with wire nuts inside the thing. Same deal here. I would bet that all those wires for the bulbs come together in the middle. This one, I bet it's up in there. And for this chandelier, it's probably down in this bottom part. So each one of these, no matter how intricate they look, all it really is to make a good lamp is just finding a way to hide the wires as creatively as you can, or not at all. Here's one that I think you can buy at Target like today. And the wire is totally out there for show. And some people really like it. And if you get a really nice colored cloth covered wire, it can look really nice to have the wire out and showing. This is maybe a faux Tiffany lamp, but a Tiffany lamp where there's little stained glass pieces all put together. And these are really expensive Americana lamps. Although my family had them, and we were not about to afford an expensive lamp. For a while, they were sold as kits, and I think probably the 80s would be my guess based on who had them in my family. But you could learn how to do this for yourself and sort of go through a kit of building your own stained glass Tiffany-like lamp. And then if you really want to get into metal pipe bending, when we have 2 pipe benders at MakeHaven, you can absolutely go buck wild building yourself a chandelier if you want. The thing you'll notice with chandeliers is that the bulbs get way smaller as you go. And that's because the current draw is definitely something they have to take into consideration. So as you get more and more light bulbs, you're taking more and more current through this wire. And so you'll have to think about how much current does a light take up and how much can you deal with it. If you're going to put an LED bulb in, it's not a problem. So if you're putting an LED bulb in, those are way lower current, lower power draw. You should feel far safer putting an LED bulb into a lamp like this. If you're putting an incandescent bulb in, like a really big one, the ones that have now become illegal, the 100-watt incandescents, not illegal, but like you can't put them on store shelves anymore. Those can start to hit a limit for how much current you should draw through these wires. But anymore, you buy a new LED bulb and you'll be totally safe, totally fine. Building a lamp is a really fun maker exercise. I'll also send forward some pictures of lamps. Like the most iconic maker thing in my family history is my grandfather made a lamp out of a well pump, which was really, I thought it was charming. Carolyn does not like it at all. And so it's back in Ohio with Mom. But, you know, that's how it is. It's just kind of fun. They're pretty easy to make happen.
Don't LEDs use DC?
LEDs, so that's a good point. An LED in general does use DC. So if we're talking about LEDs.
So it has like a transformer built in.
Yes. So inside of the LED bulb, if we were to take one of these and try and process what's going on here, inside of one of these bulbs, there are LEDs that are running on DC inside, but at the top is where the LED is. And all of this down here is the transformer. And so early ones had these fins because they were cooling off the transformer as it was going from AC to DC inside the bulb. Mm-hmm. And so that's why they've all got these plastic chunky parts on the bottom. Those are where the transformers are hidden. And these like higher end ones have a metal look to the transformer because they're trying to they're literally heat sinks trying to get heat out of there. And so here's your incandescent bulb. This is the regular type. And this is the compact fluorescent bulb. These have got mercury in them. Don't use one of those if you can avoid it. They're fine, but the capacitors eventually go bad in them, and you don't want to throw these out in the regular trash. If you can avoid getting these ever, please do so. Switching over to LEDs is a good move. These work really well, and these fins were all for cooling. Now there's LEDs that look like this, which is neat. Those are the LED parts themselves, the part that glows, and they can hide all of the circuits for control way down in the bottom. So we've gotten much, much better at this. It was the early generations that had all these ribs and fins and things to cool them off. And now it's just the very high power ones. These were some of the very first ones when we were just starting to explore LED lights in homes. And now you can get these where all of the electronics are hidden down at the bottom, or even like there's this ridiculous stuff where you've got all of your circuits down there, but those are like generally regular LEDs. And here's even surface mount LEDs that are on a cylinder with all of the controller stuff inside. So with an LED bulb like this, what they're doing is they're packing all of the fancy circuitry that it takes to go from AC to DC in the bottom half of the bulb. So they're doing all of that to go from the AC of the wall to the DC that an LED needs inside of the bulb itself, which for you, the end user who's making the lamp, that means that you don't have to worry about it whatsoever. It's just going to be powered directly, and then that's how it goes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. How is this the longest living light bulb? Yeah. What, I feel like you've got a lot to say about that, Jamie.
So much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The good news about LEDs is that they will outlast the capacitors in those controller circuits. LEDs will last for like 10,000 hours as a recommended lifespan. So in like normal use, that's somewhere in the ballpark of 20 years. So it's totally worth it. If you're thinking about how to upgrade, switching over to those is a good way to go. Oh, here's one that's all pulled apart. And so the simplest way to do this, and this is the simplest possible circuit, is they've just got this plugged in and then 2 diodes that take the AC circuit and say, we're only going to let 1/2 of the current flow. This is something that you'd see on a really cheap LED bulb where they're taking the sine wave and they're just making it like above the middle half so that they're blinking on and off 120 times a second or 120 times a second. And so if you look at them just wrong, you can see that they're blinking really fast. It's a really cheap way to make an LED work in a circuit though, if you can eat up enough of the voltage. So there's a lot to unpack here with like what makes them work. But the good news is that we don't have to do that today. And we're not going to be building these high voltage LED bulbs, but they are interesting. Oh, here's a good diagram where you've got your controller in the bottom, the housing down there, a ring for cooling, and then your LEDs go here. And then this bubble shell really just diffuses the light away. So that's really what's going on inside of an LED bulb, which is good. They're all built to be retrofit into the old fixtures so that nobody had to go through and change every house's wiring to use LED bulbs. Although if you wanted, you could probably wire your whole house up for a lower voltage in DC if you wanted to be that strange.
They're great. I have them in my car, and it's like 1 watt an hour.
Yeah.
Sometimes even less than that. It's great.
Yeah, no, it can totally be the way to go. If you've got total control over your electrical system, putting in a low voltage line to run them is really, really helpful. Also, there's like Kate was asking about, is it okay if the wiring is not got a ground? If you've got low voltage, like you can run a lot through your wires without having to worry about anything. There's basically no rules about running low voltage wires through housing. And by no rules, I mean, there are rules, but they're far less particular because it's just way safer.
Yeah, like you could lick
Yeah.
the wires and nothing's going to happen.
Yep.
I mean, like that low voltage though.
Yeah.
DC, because high voltage DC can be dangerous.
High voltage DC can be bad, or like if you can get if you've got a really conductive thing, low voltage DC licking is going to be fine. Sticking them into skin is not going to be fine. But generally low voltage is going to be totally safe. You're not going to run into any problems. So in any case, as we're building lamp making kits, this is the way to go. You start here, you make it into something that you're interested in, and then there's lots of options for how to spin it up from here. But these always give you a good place to start. Having some of these long tubes can be really helpful if you've got something that you want to make a nice tall lamp of. Oh, fake stained glass with translucent vinyl gel sheets. That sounds exciting. There's lots of good options. Okay, so it's 9. I want to hear what happened this week in metalworking. So let's stop having me talk and instead hear what's going on with all of you. Should I, if you want, you can unmute yourself and just share with us all, or I can pick based on order on my screen, whichever's best.
Hi, can you
Yeah, we can hear you.
hear me?
Yep.
Am I okay? So I took the Bridgeport Mill class this week, and I also I bought some welding things like welding gloves and other things like that, as well as some metal that Ada suggested might be useful for starting with some jewelry making. And basically I'm making one piece, which then I am hoping to make a more complicated version of this bracelet, which would be a piece with 3 metals, which I'm not quite sure how they would work together in terms of their melting temperatures, but I'm looking into that right now. And I have some of this kind, you were discussing sketches and mock-ups, and it's very funny because I did that for some of the jewelry designs this week. So that made me happy to see. And I also began planning an end of year project that might incorporate a few of the different things that we've done, which thus far is still a metal project. It is or will be a lap desk into which I'm hoping to integrate a Raspberry Pi. But right now, what I'm doing and thinking about doing and designing is making the hinges, because that is a sort of metal work that obviously I don't really know how to do and would very much like to learn. So the planning of the end of year project is right now making hinges.
Cool.
And that is what I've been working on this week. Oh, and I took the Bridgeport class yesterday, and it was wonderful. And it's a great class. And it is very hard to use one of those Bridgeports if you're 5'2". And but the other one it isn't. So yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Cool. And Mogata, you did the Bridgeport class also, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was a lot going on with that. You know, it was nice to get exposure to the machine. There's a lot of different bits and combinations that you could plug in to get all sorts of 3D parts and components, you know.
Yeah.
For me, just getting the part locked in the right place on the vise was a challenge. I didn't quite get there, but I look forward to playing around with it a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the Bridgeport is like the raw and untamed version of a CNC, where the CNC, the computer will take care of lots of the work for you. And the Bridgeport is like you wrestling against the high power machine to get it to do what you want.
Yeah.
And the wrestling match, you don't always win. But as long as there's no blood, you're fine.
I walked away with no blood, so that's good.
That's a win.
So, yeah, I can go into my project.
Yeah, if you want to, sure.
Yeah. So I've badged in a bunch of different metal tools and welding. So what I went with was a MIG weld, getting 1 inch by 1 inch cold rolled steel welded on the edges. And so what I call this is incomplete chassis. Yeah, I mean, I got one that the side's a little under measured, but kind of a nice way to see how strong it is. You know, I mean, it's not moving.
Yeah, no, it's totally.
Yeah, so it wasn't. I guess my biggest thing that I've noticed as I was welding is I kept lifting it up. So there's parts of here where you'll see gaps.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't quite connect. So from what Jeffrey was telling us, those could be weak points. And so try to keep the metal tip close to the material as you're welding it. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, I think it's the favorite thing probably the most favorite thing I learned here.
That's great. Yeah, welding, it's just like such a fun, it feels like a superpower for sure. It's just a fun activity.
And I also wanted to share my completed sewing project with everybody here too. So
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah, I made a pillow for my couch over here. It's pretty old.
Awesome.
That's lovely.
Yeah, so I'll get the sequins in here. Took a little pointer from Kate to stitch a pocket in the back. So I'll just drop that in after I get that soldered and ready. So
There you go. That's awesome.
yes.
Yeah, that's really cool. Great work.
Thank you.
All right. Next up. Ben, you're unmuted. You want to go?
I'm happy to. I think I've shown some folks in the class, but I made this like simple coffee dripper thing. So a cone coffee brewer could sit in there with a filter in it. And I just started with a brass rod that I cut into a few pieces, one of which I bent into the circle. And then I brazed it all together with Ada's help. Thank you, Ada. And then, yeah, put thread
Welded
in
it.
this side of the, welded it. Wait, but when I called it welding before, you said it's not welding because I wasn't adding filler material.
No, you were. No, it's welding because it's all the same metal, and you actually melted it together. Like you joined those two pieces of metal because you can't braze brass together because the brazing rods that are at MakeHaven are brass. So if the brazing rod melts, the brass is also getting to its melting temperature. So you're welding it. You're just doing a much more analog kind of weld than like the MIG.
Ada helped me weld it together.
Sorry to be pedantic.
No, that's good. That's good. Also, that was the focus of last week's class. So I should really have that.
That turned out nice. It was in pieces before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks real good.
Yeah, it's really like a striking look to have brass and wood together like that. And it looks like a nicely polished piece. I'm sure it looks wonderful on the counter. All right, who wants to go next?
I can go.
Here, did that me? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. In terms of like completed projects, these are extremely simple, but I just made a couple of very simple hand tools that, I mean, they look extremely simple, but they're important for some types of folds that I had wanted to do. And it's, you can't buy you can't really buy the exact tool that I needed. So I heat treated, I got like cheap bits from Harbor Freight, annealed it, ground it down, shaped it, got the exact curve that I wanted. And then hardened it and tempered it. And then this one is, I took a screwdriver, and this is a tool for like opening, getting some, for beginning the opening process on some folds. And it's like just curved in a way that you won't, or you're extremely unlikely to gouge the metal of the fold. And I picked a screwdriver because, first of all, it has a handle on it already, get some leverage, but the tempering of screwdrivers is usually like about the most tempered of any steel tools, because they don't need to be particularly hard, and you're giving them all this torque. So if it was too hard, the screwdriver would just snap. And it's better for the screwdriver to like, just deform slightly. So I did not have to harden and temper this one, which just made it a little quicker.
Yeah.
And then these are just like some little folding experiments that I was working on. None of them are a complete piece. But there was like a specific combination of two folds that I was trying to do. One is called a T-fold and the other is just called a line fold. And like this is a kind of fold that I've used a lot in work before. But it has like kind of an anatomical look to it, but it doesn't like have a specific anatomical structure to it. And I've been wanting to do some sculpture with this stuff, some figurative sculpture. So I was just working on like different patterns to try to produce things that like, this was like one iteration of trying to make things a little more vertebral. Is that an adjective?
That's totally an adjective.
And there's parts of it that I'm, I think, well, I made the mistake of deciding that I was going to unfold it late at night. And so it doesn't have quite as much texture as this one because I should have done a few more courses of hammering. But
yeah, they're iterations.
Yeah. And then I didn't do anything with this copper because I want to have the wood cut first, but now that the CNC is like actually working, I started cutting the pieces for my nightstand from the wood cutting unit, and there's some copper inlay for that, and so I like bought the different sized pieces of copper that I was going to need to make the inlays.
Cool. Yeah, and it's very exciting that that the CNC is up and running.
Yeah.
And that you're on the cutting edge of how that works. I'm super excited because when we get to that week, we'll all be exploring that space at once. So it'll be neat to see sort of how that works. There'll be 2 weeks of CNC. So you'll learn like how CNCs in general work and then how the big one works. So it's fun to look forward to what that's going to be.
Yeah, it made me very happy to finally have it cut the piece that I wanted. When like those things came out the right shape and all the same shape, that was a great moment.
Yep. Yeah, and it'll be so exciting to get like a real thing to come off of there. And that'll be, everybody is, you know, we're at different levels of getting our way to running the CNC, but it definitely feels like a machine where when you get something off of there, it's a big win. It's why my students who built those instruments, they were very excited about like the ability to pull an instrument off of the CNC. So yeah. All right, let's see. Next person. Kate, were you about to go? Do you want to share?
I can, sure.
Yeah.
All right, let's see if I can do this. I was going to try and share my screen, so hopefully this will work. Share screen. Yes. Sure, share everything. Are we seeing my screen?
Yep.
So this was my adventures in metalworking. So grinding down the metal. This is when I discovered that the MIG welder still had the spooling gun left on it, and I did not know how to change that. But luckily Brandon was able to FaceTime and walk me through it, so that was great. That threw me off a little bit. So speaking of our failure discussions earlier today, after being thrown off by that, I think a little overzealous to get into my welding, didn't have the triangle there with my setup. Angles do matter, so you can see not quite the straight leg you might want, but you know, the weld actually came out nice, but whatever, these things, this is how we learn.
Yep.
Getting some of my welds to look a little more rivery, it's still a long way to go. Speaking of the fuck ups, here's one of my other favorites. This is like breaking a needle when you make a mask. I hear this is actually the last weld I did. I think it's called like sticking the torch or something, I don't know, of course, but I had to get a picture of that. But it goes back to our conversation earlier about these are the things that I will remember, and going forward, you know, I'm definitely going to, you know, all the other legs are very straight, so this is how you learn. So this is the table. This is my walking table. As you can see, one leg comes out a little bit, which I thought was, you know, kind of fun. I did use ratchet strap to try to reform it a little. We have a little, if you can see that slow motion angle grinder with a guest appearance by Ben in the background there, working on his project, just because I think the angle grinder and fireworks are fun. So grinding, eventually moved on to finishing, because this is going to be an outdoor table. This is another, someday we'll have a party and I can have this outside for people to put drinks on. So I put it with Rust-Oleum. The top is just wood that I laser cut. I was working on this while waiting for election results, so I thought it'd be nice to have a table that had reminder messaging that was important to me. So I made that as the top, had my daughter put her to work, finally put the top on, and then ended up actually having a finished table that stands up and holds thing in the end. So
oh, that's great. That's lovely. You put together such a nice narrative on how that plays out in your documentation. Well done.
Yeah, the storytelling is great.
I was sad that I didn't get a video of the auto feed on the horizontal bandsaw, because that's just the coolest thing. And I think I was just so like enjoyed watching it that I forgot to video it. But so next time.
The horizontal bandsaw is like the unsung hero in the metal shop. It's like a magical tool that does exactly what you want perfectly every time. Let's see. Who would like to go next? We've got a few people. Let's see. There's Jamie, Ruby, Layla, Anna.
Hey,
Yeah, Ruby.
how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm alright. I feel like this week or last week was kind of a fail for me, which I don't mind, but I kind of realized a few things, and I need to like move around I need to change the way I manage my time, and I think that means like scaling back on other things that I do outside of class. But that's good because I know what I need to do. So I got badged on welding and I really like it. I need a lot of practice, and I think I'm gonna go and check in with the facilitator again. And my goal is to get comfortable enough to make a little like my plant. It's always about the plants. A little table, little chair for my plant. So something in metal. That's a realistic goal. I feel like I can work towards. But anyways, besides that, got these earrings. I haven't soldered them yet. I haven't had a chance to move in that direction. Started sanding them, and there's a facilitator who's recommending me to try a different way instead of just sawing them by hand. I don't really know. Find out, and that's about it for me.
Cool. That's great. You definitely made some progress on those earrings, and then coming along with welds is always exciting. So lots of fun. All right, Lila, do you wanna go next?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm behind on the welding. I'm gonna plan to go and get badged this week on that and the horizontal bandsaw. So I'm behind on my metal shop work.
But can you share what you did do? Because it was amazing.
The rug.
Yeah.
I thought I talked about it last week, but maybe not.
Oh,
No?
there's it looks like Ruby wants to say, and I know
Yes.
JR saw it too. You made another rug.
Okay, yeah, I made the rug. I don't know if I have a picture like handy to share, but why don't I do that and I'll pop it up on the in-class chat when we're done.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because I feel like you made such inroads in how to get the tufting gun to work that now it's like absolutely a problem that you have solved. And
Yeah, I feel like I can maybe crank a couple more out just to say I'm completely comfortable with it. But yeah, I can tuft, I think. I think I can tuft. I can tuft. I'm gonna
Yeah.
say it.
So I
I'm a
have some pictures.
tufter.
I have some pictures I took of it. If you want me to share those.
Sure.
All right. Let me. Oh, I have to become a host, or I can just share the links in an album to you guys.
Yeah, Kate's the host right now. So
Here, I'll put them in an album.
And I also went back and worked in the wood shop a little this week, which I started to make a shelf from scratch, and Rudy helped me from beginning to where I am now. And I think it's coming out. I think I'm more excited about the shelf than I was about the box because I used a piece of repurposed wood where I didn't really have to do much to it. But with this, I started from scratch. I squared it, and I didn't take any pictures along the way. But I'm going to make another one when I'm done with this because I have a couple brackets that I purchased. So I wanted to make a couple shelves. So I was
Right.
doing that in the wood shop this week.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's sometimes like going back and just having the little bit of extra perspective can really be helpful. Also, the album came through in the chat. It's really like I don't know if you're headed through the space in the next couple of days, you should definitely take a look
Ooh.
at it. It's so nice.
Oh,
Well,
thanks. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like when I take pictures with my camera, it looks like not good. So I appreciate when other people take things and I see it from like their perspective. And it's also one of those projects where you need to walk away from it for a little bit because it's a little funky looking, but I'm just happy I got it to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. JR and I were brainstorming like, okay, what's the next steps with this? Can we turn it into a rug making robot? Do you want to do classes? Like, what are the next things to figure out? Like I feel like you opened a can of worms with this.
I know, and I would play with other versions of it. Another member was asking me about it, but I think people are, when I tell them they need a frame, like she wanted to buy mine, and I'm like, well, you can use this, it's here. So I think that's people get intimidated that they have to make and have a frame to be started to get going with it, because there's no other way.
Yeah.
Some sort of frame or like a set of frames if you want to get it going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are all pieces that'd be neat to sort of work out and like get to a point where we could make it into more of a class where there's like a structured thing. So that's really cool.
And I think Jamie should consider shag in her van build.
Their van build. Pronouns
yeah.
are they, them. I was thinking about that
Okay.
when I saw that and embedding like heating into it, some kind of element that would heat it. But
yeah.
Cool.
So Jamie, do you want to share what you were up to this week?
Sure. So I got my welding badge, which is something I've wanted for years to learn how to weld. And I didn't get around to finishing my solar rack, so I want to work on that this week and catch up on that in the next couple of weeks. I especially, even though I think it's structurally sound, I do want to fill in some of those holes I made that aren't necessary. And that requires learning how to also change the spool. I don't want to do that on my own, and I don't feel like I could do that with an online facilitator. I really just want some one-on-one help with the welder. So that's kind of in my horizon. What I did do and accomplish this week, besides the badge, was I used a hole saw, which doesn't really sound that interesting, but it was the first time I ever used one. It was a 4-inch one.
Yeah.
And I cut a hole in the floor of my van to install a heater. And there was many layers. So the first thing I did was I was really super nervous about it because I didn't want to just go and cut a hole in my van. I mean, I did it for the window I had to install and the fan above, but not like this, not like with a hole saw, and it had to be perfect. So I kind of replicated. I took a piece of scrap metal that was the same gauge metal, and I replicated the layers of like polyiso, which is my insulation, the Baltic birch wood, and the sheet vinyl I installed, and I practiced, and that thing bucks, and I was told it would, so I put it on a clutch so it wouldn't grab and jolt me and break my wrists, because I can't have broken hands, and
Yep.
it didn't work on clutch, and I was using an 18-volt drill because that's what I had. I got it on sale like last year during the holidays, and it worked, but then today when I did it for real, it caught on fire. So I had to spend an hour and drive to a friend's place to pick up like a real drill that you plug in and has like real kick to it, and that was super scary because it would grab me, but I braced for it, and I got it done. And what I did learn through that process was you really need to clean out like stuff and like take out the layers, because there just came this point where I couldn't get that last little piece of metal to come off, because it's corrugated floor, you know, it has dipped. So part of it just wasn't grabbing, and you know, you have to rock the circular saw, so you decrease the area, and just make it easier for the saw to grab without kicking back, and so that's kind of what I learned, just how to use a circular saw, which didn't produce anything that looks pretty, but it's going to be functional. I'm really excited to have a heater in my car. That's like such a big thing for me. I have really cold hands. I have Raynaud's in my hands and feet, and so winters have been pretty harsh, and this is exciting. And learning how to use this, and to just, if you ever use one, clean it out, like take out the layers, because there's only a certain amount of depth that can go until it's just not going to work. And maybe that's obvious to some people, but it wasn't to me.
No, it's tough. Sometimes you like want to put a screwdriver in the side and like leverage them out. A 4-inch hole saw is not a joke. Like I had to cut 2 holes in the side of my house for venting out of a bathroom and a kitchen. And both times it was intense. Like you got to imagine it's more like a shotgun than like a drill. It can, because if it kicks hard, and you've got a lot of power coming at you all in one motion. Yeah.
And it did pull, like it grabbed. So like, yeah, you know, but it's cool. I feel like it's a really good skill to learn, and I feel like it's only going to improve. I know it sounds like simple, but drilling is like something I do a lot, and I always feel like it's something I could improve on, like in terms of accuracy. So yeah, and this is just, it's done. I got it done, and I've been nervous about this for months. So yeah.
Well, there you go. Congratulations. All right, next up, let's see. Do we have Anna? Anything to work through? Let's see.
Hold on one second.
Yeah, you're good.
I didn't get a super bunch of stuff done this week. I decided to basically, so the welding badge is something that I'm interested in, but I'm kind of not super in love with the setup that's in MakeHaven, and that's purely because I'm really short and the way that I have to maneuver. So I'm learning how to TIG weld as opposed to MIG weld with my partner who owns a TIG weld. But the biggest struggle so far is finding a helmet that isn't too big for me. So a welding helmet was like on my list of things to search for as I went around this week trying to kind of find something. And that was kind of an interesting thing to see all the different kinds of welding helmets that exist. I did not know that there were that many different kinds. And my goal was to basically weld a kind of just like, essentially just like a metal rod to a metal sphere to make the clapper for my bell.
Oh, yeah.
Just very simple, nothing complicated, but it turned out more complicated because obviously you need to acquire the safety equipment to weld. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. And then I used like a belt grinder to start grinding down the weird edge on my tank. But I kind of like ended up with like really wonky edges. So it's currently at my partner's place where the belt grinder is.
Gotcha.
And I have to fix it. It's like, it kind of like, I tilted it in a weird way because I didn't have a fence. And so I ended up with like this weird angle on the side. So I have to kind of, it's going to end up, I'm going to end up with a much shorter bell than I originally intended just from having to try to get a straight edge on it. So that's kind of an interesting, like, oh, I wanted to do this tiny adjustment and now it's turning into so many different adjustments. So there's lots of iterations of this bell so far. And then I have plans for the lamp. I have a specifically weird situation where I don't have any light switches in my room. I have no lighting at all. So basically this is just like a desk lamp that's kind of hanging up. And you can see in the corner right there, that's where I'm gonna hang my lamp from. And I measured it. I actually need 18 feet of cord to get to an outlet.
Cool. Yeah, so. and that is like, I don't know where, but I'm sure that they sell it in 20 and 25 foot lengths.
Yeah,
so
that's kind of what I've been finding, because at first all the kits only come with 12 feet of length.
Yeah.
So I think I'm just gonna have to kind of make my own kit, like a deconstructed kit. And then I proceeded to break my website this week, which I didn't mean to do, but I learned some things.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
Yep. So that was kind of interesting. I was trying to update some things and add some videos and work with some widgets, and I guess I just did something with a widget and the coding that it all just kind of, and I ended up with like a page error, and I was like, where's all my stuff?
Yeah, the internet can be frustrating. It's definitely hard to like pick through and do all the things. If you ever need any help, let me know. I'm happy to help. There's also, it's really good advice that I saw, and this is examples of things that I've really enjoyed watching happen naturally with the class. But Lila was showing Ada how to get to, is it Linda? The internet, the library's resource for learning how to do. Linda. It's Linda. Yeah. And then, so you might check Linda if you want to just generally go through internet things, but if you've got specific questions, I'm happy to help.
Yeah,
Anna.
yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
So yeah, so the plan is to do some welding this week, work on my lamp design, order some parts, take some more measurements, and yeah, that's what I got.
Cool. Yeah. And it's going to happen. There's going to be some weeks where they feel like more of a setback than movement forward, but it definitely, all of it is a accumulation of experience that indirectly is leading us forward. Also, I dropped in the chat a link to a 25-foot cable. Oh, it's currently unavailable. I just saw that.
It's okay. I'm actually going to check. I found this really cool company in Brooklyn that has an Etsy storefront, and they have the fabric covered wires.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to see, I know they have a 30 length one. I'm going to see if I can find a smaller one.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then also, it's not terrible to put a plug on the end. It's less bad than you would expect. There's like kits for plugs to get the end. So if it's 5 feet too long, you can cut it and shorten it from there.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I'm going to have to also do that to install a switch on it, which I'm not looking forward to, but I will just watch tons of tutorials on it.
Yeah, and the instructions are good, and it's not as bad as you'd expect.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. Did everybody get a chance to talk? Who's here? It looks like, I think, did we hit everybody? It's harder to tell on Zoom. But yeah, it sounds like we had a good week. There's lots of interesting stuff to check out and to see what happened. I'm looking forward to see how lamps come out. But again, if you're busy and it doesn't work out for you for the lamps to work, this is one that I would say is optional among all of our things for the portfolio. It's definitely a good one to get experience with. But if you're checking through, trying to make sure that you get your time taken care of, you're welcome to give this one a pass. Definitely want to make sure that you think about the humanity parts of things, especially with the world as tumultuous as it is right now. But yeah, it's good to chat, good to talk with everybody. And thank you to Ada for all the help for everybody this past 2 weeks with metalworking. Your experience has been super helpful. So
no problem. It's been fun.
Yeah, just generally thank you. And it's been lovely. And next week we'll do Arduino part 1 is the game plan. So we're headed there so we can do more remote and keep everybody as safe as possible. And if you need anything, send me a message through Slack. I'm always available there. So I think that's it, everybody.
Okay. Corey, are you officially having hours Wednesday and Thursday this coming week?
Oh, yes, that's a good point. I am, and I'll push out a message about that through Slack also, but Wednesday and Thursday, because I think that it helps for people to get that sort of guidance earlier in the week, probably. There was a thumbs up on that at some point in the Slack channel. So Wednesday, Thursday. Cool. See you, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks. Good
Bye.
night.
Night.
Hi, JR. Oh, you're muted. See ya. See, and